Welcome back to the Femme FC Podcast. Today we have Gaby Smith. Gaby is the performance sports scientist for Bay FC, the first NWSL team in the Bay Area. She plays a key role in fostering competitive excellence by implementing player monitoring systems and developing tailored training, recovery, and game day protocols to optimize performance. With years of experience managing performance soccer programs in collegiate, professional, and international environments, Gaby brings an innovative approach to sports science and athlete development by focusing on integrating cutting-edge performance strategies with player-centered care to drive excellence on and off the field. Gaby holds a master's degree in exercise physiology and certifications as a certified performance and sports scientist and certified strength and conditioning specialist. Leveraging advanced performance technologies, she delivers data-driven insights to enhance fitness, readiness, and long-term player health. She's proud to contribute to Bay FC's mission of becoming a leading global sports franchise and inspiring communities through the beautiful game while setting new standards in sports science and player development. Gaby, thanks so much for being on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation all about training load and planning a week on both a team and individual level. So thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to kind of dive into things a little bit with you.
Yeah, so before we dive into that, would you mind just kind of talking us through your role at Bay FC and some of maybe your guiding principles that shape how you approach training, load monitoring, and planning for the team?
Yeah, so I think people hear my title as like sports scientist and kind of automatically think like in charge of all things technology, and that kind of is the case. Like we've got GPS, we've got force plates, heart rate straps, kind of all of that typical thing, those things. And that's really a big part of my job, kind of managing and overseeing that, collecting all of that data, making sure that it's cleaned and presented in a way that makes sense to the people who kind of need to use that. So coaches kind of have different needs in terms of what they need to know and what they understand, and how they like to receive that information versus kind of what our medical staff or someone else has access to. So kind of being able to clean, collect, and present that in a way that makes sense to all of them. But there's also kind of a whole nother side of things that I'm sure we're kind of going to talk about in more detail later. Kind of like you talk about planning the training week, and just kind of managing what each load should be kind of throughout the given day. So there's actually a lot of interaction with the coaches as well, and kind of planning that goes on that side of the world is too. So kind of have to be able to talk about them in terms of what's going on the session that day, what the week looks like, kind of laying out things with them and being able to talk about drill timing, drill size, kind of how many players are involved as well, which I think a lot of people don't realize is kind of falls on the plate of a sports scientist too. So it's not just kind of all in the tech world staring at a screen all day. Like one of my favorite parts of the job is kind of being able to interact with the coaches and still be on the field and get to be more close to the game still, is huge for me.
Yeah, so you mentioned there about not just collecting the data, but presenting it in a way that the viewer, the end user can take in and absorb and use, right? Because there's no point in creating all of these reports if no one's using it. And
Yep.
so how do you go about deciding how you're going to present that information, whether that's to an athlete, the medical staff, the coaching staff? What guides your decision making and how you present that information? And can you give any specific examples of like how you actually change the presentation of the data for those different groups?
Yeah, I think different things are important kind of to each group as well, and being able to have the relationship base to know what is important to people and kind of being able to communicate that the most effective way for them. But that doesn't really happen until you kind of know them as people first, and know how they communicate and how they digest information. Like we've got some players that they all have access to kind of their own data through an app, and some of them look at it regularly and they want it, like they want to see the numbers, they want to see tables. Some of them are more kind of graph people, but some people, even though they always have access to it, whenever they want to see it will still come up and ask me about it, because like the words and kind of the conversation are always kind of more actionable or understandable for them. Kind of the same with our coaches. Like I've worked with coaches before who like religiously will open the training report, look at the graphs, see kind of where each player falls, and then kind of within the daily report that I send out, it was like, yeah, we hit our targets for today or we didn't. But kind of regardless, here's kind of how we have to react or kind of change the rest of the week, or hey, we're on track. All of that's kind of spelled out in words in the email, but I've had coaches once again who it's like I can't read it, like it doesn't process right. So like can we have a conversation about it? Our coach now really likes having like visuals laid out for him along with the conversation. So kind of being able to have the visual there as we talk through things is really helpful for him. So I think that's one thing that he has found, but also like I've also found what is kind of the minimum amount of information or what are going to be the key points for especially kind of players and coaches to get your point across because there can be information overload. Someone like me, lots of numbers make sense and I can kind of put things together, but I think for people who aren't as in this side of the world on a day-to-day basis, kind of like what are the top three things or kind of what I try to keep it to, just to keep it simple but still get your point across.
Yeah, you mentioned there that even though players have access to their data in the app, which is great, we didn't have that when I was working in the league. So everyone was coming up, what are my numbers? What are my numbers? But even though players have access to that, you mentioned how some of them kind of need the conversation behind it, right? And explanation of the why behind it and the context. And so I'm assuming that when you send information to coaches, there's also a level of that explanation or interpretation on your end. How do you go about doing that, and what's your process for not just sharing the data, but then also here's my interpretation of it and how you can use it?
Um, on the player side, I think it really helps when they come and ask questions, or if I initiate a conversation with them. I think they appreciate it because then they know that there is some level of care that's going into them as a player rather than just, oh, yep, we're all going to training today and here we go again, day, however many days we've been training. It's like, okay, no, like you are looking out for me as a player and care about what I'm doing personally. And I think that creates just a great relationship in terms of they know that they're being looked out for and it's not just a member of the team. And that just creates a lot of trust and willingness to kind of open up conversations that they might not be willing to have or really even go out of their way to have when they know that you care about them as a player and a person rather than just another person on the team. And then I think from the coaching standpoint, once again, each player kind of has different needs throughout the training week and being able to have those conversations for whether it's this person has played 90 minutes for every game the past however many games we've had, or this person hasn't, so they might need to stay out with me and do a little bit extra at the end, and just kind of being able to talk your way through that with coaches as well. And once again, they know that each player is being looked out for them as an individual rather than just kind of a member of the team. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the reason we're doing all of this is, yes, to help players perform their best and extend their careers and be injury free on the player side of things. But the best availability, like the best ability is availability, or whatever that saying is, in terms of helping the coach win games. And that's ultimately what we're here to do as well. So I think it's kind of double sided in terms of being beneficial for the players and the coaches. But at the end of the day, it's all kind of relationship based and letting the players know we're looking out for them and letting the coaches know that we're looking out for the players as well and we're trying to help them as individual players based off of what they need, help us ultimately win games as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you're making, that ultimately the end goal is more or less the same and that we share that with whether it's the players or the coaches. You know, we as the performance medical staff share those goals of availability, player longevity, player health, player performance. And so describing the data that way or giving that why where you start on common ground, I think is a really beneficial way to start that conversation. And I really liked what you said in terms of when you're discussing with the athletes and to the coaches to some extent as well, but the athletes love to feel like you have their individual interests at heart. And that can be really difficult in team sport. But the second that you go and show like their personalized, individualized data and what you're doing with it, like that is immediate trust and buy-in from them
Yeah.
that, oh, it's not just what the team is doing, like what am I as an individual doing?
Yeah. And I think we've
So,
gotten, go ahead. There's just been
nope,
days where
nope, go
like
for
so and so,
it.
like if someone didn't, like, I don't know, maybe our outside backs didn't do much at training that day and it was supposed to be a day that they needed a lot of high speed running. Like, I have no problem at this point going up to some of our outside backs and be like, hey, you want to hit a couple runs for me? Because they know I'm not just being like, hey, gotta go run now. It's like, oh, I didn't get what I needed to for me to be able to perform on the weekend. And those conversations are just so much easier and haven't gotten any pushback, where in the past it's been like, well, what do you mean I have to run more? So I think it's just really helped with that side of things.
We're going to talk about kind of the weekly planning and your workflow for that. But what you just brought up sparked some curiosity to me in terms of your daily workflow. And are you going to players before training and letting them know what their targets are, or maybe at the start of the week and letting them know, like, hey, in case we don't get this in training, we may have to do some extra top ups at the end, or hey, just so you know, we're a little bit high on sprint distance this week, so there may be a chance that I modify you at some point today, or ask coach to have you rest or take turns with another player. When are those conversations with players happening in your personal workflow?
Um, Usually if we have an idea of like, hey, t through the flow of the week throughout the year, players kind of have a pretty good idea of like today's going to be our bigger day and everything like that. So they'll typically know like, hey, might need to do a lot of high speed running today or what to expect. If there are kind of based off of what the session plan is, like it might be one of those things where I do go to someone while they're doing activation or before training, like, hey, this is the plan for training today, just so you know, like this might be coming your way. Or if it's a typical high minute player and they didn't play a lot on the weekend for whatever reason, like, hey, you were super low in whatever last week, like, we might need to bridge the gap a little bit this week so it's not a huge shock to your system as we go into the game the next day. There's also kind of, especially as we get into later parts of the year, having those conversations with players being like, hey, how are you feeling? You played a ton of minutes. We've talked about potentially kind of rotating you through a small-sided game or something. So don't be surprised if this happens during training, because sometimes if they don't know, then they're like, why isn't coach playing me in this drill? Why am I sitting out? Kind of all of
Mm-hmm.
those kind of questions start to spiral. So as proactive as we can be in terms of what we know about the session and communicating that on the front end, I think just alleviate some stress that can come up throughout the session if players don't know what's going on. So just kind of being open with those conversations with them. And things can always change when we get on the field. Like drills go longer than expected, sessions could take turns you don't expect. But trying to be proactive and answer those, like ask those questions with the coaches ahead of time, so you have answers and can then have those conversations with players, because we really are kind of the bridge between the coaching staff and the players once team meetings happen and they start getting ready for training.
Yeah. I when I first started working in pro soccer, I was in an environment where it was kind of the norm to not tell players what the session was going to be. And, if they asked, just kind of being like, you'll see when you get out there. And that kind of blew my mind. Like, I was like, none of us show
Yeah.
up to work with no idea of what we're going to be asked to
Yeah.
do. Like, why are we asking that of the players? So, what
Yeah.
is obviously every coach is different. Different coaching styles exist. There can be coaching changes in the middle of the season, which changes things. And then, in your situation, a coach leaving at the end of the season and we'll have to adjust to someone else next season. So, what is, or I guess what would be like practical tips for someone in having those conversations with the coach? And what is your current setup like, where is the coach happy for you to say ahead of time, hey, I'm looking out for like the outside backs. They hit a lot of high speed this week so far, so may need to rein that in a little bit. Do you talk about that on a day-to-day basis, just at the start of the week and then updates as needed? how do you go about communicating with the coaches? And again, recognizing that it can be different for different coaches and personalities.
Yeah, I think consistent communication is usually the best, just to kind of make sure that we're on the same page pre-training, post-training. So we'll typically kind of have get a little meeting in the morning, just being like, hey, what's the plan for the session? Kind of just go over. We have players fill out wellness, so if we see anything kind of unusual pop up in there, or just revisit, hey, player A, B, and C have played a lot recently, or kind of like you mentioned, like they've done a lot of high speed running recently, might just want to be something to keep an eye on. So those are happening in the morning as well. And then throughout training, we'll have kind of live monitoring going on. So if anything does go crazy, like our outside backs are making a million runs up and down the wing, then we can kind of modify or try to modify in session. Sometimes it doesn't happen just because, hey, this is what we need to get for today. Like, okay, you're the head coach. That's your, like, you are the boss right now. So then just being able to kind of have those conversations at the end of the day and a little end of day debrief just in terms of like, this is what we said we were going to do today. This is kind of what we actually did. So then kind of how do we plan for tomorrow if there is anything that changed. But yeah, those conversations are happening pretty regularly, sometimes multiple times a day, just based off of kind of what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So we kind of started off with a conversation around communication and how important that is, explaining the why behind things to and the context behind the data to medical staff, coaching staff, players. So let's get a little more technical now. So can
Yep.
you walk us through like what a typical training week looks like for you at Bay FC? So let's say you've played on a Saturday and then have another game the following Saturday. Let's rule out a midweek game for this
Yeah.
example.
The ideal
The
situation
ideal
right
week.
there.
How do you structure that week from the team perspective?
Yep. So if we'll typically have the day after the game off, so we'll be off match day +1 and then come in the following day. So on that day, starters or anyone who played a lot of minutes is still going to typically be pretty fatigued, kind of coming off of a match. So we will have them on that day. We have the entire team actually run the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo. And we'll look at kind of their heart rate at the end of the yo-yo when they rest for a minute, just to kind of see the difference. And if we're looking for the difference and for it to come back down. So if it doesn't come back down, either if they're a high minute player, probably still fatigued. If they're not a high minute player, then maybe they're losing fitness, and that might be something that we need to address. So kind of being able to see both ends of that. After the yo-yo, starters and high minute players typically go off and do recovery. They'll do mobility, they'll stretch, they'll kind of watch the rest of the session. Lower minute players will get a more kind of small sided session. Some of the change of direction work that they didn't get on the game day that our higher minute players did do. So that's kind of typically it's a shorter session, smaller spaces, 60 minutes in and out, just nothing crazy. The following day will be another kind of smaller-ish space day, more of our intensive day, focusing on kind of accelerations, change of direction, that sort of thing, with the whole group back in. Um, and then the following day will be our biggest session of the week. So we'll do a lot of high-speed running, a lot of sprinting. We'll typically play 11v11 for a certain amount of time, depending on kind of physical goals for the week. We'll have our sprint exposure that day, so we want players to hit. I prefer at least 95. A lot of people are good with 90. I like 95% of their max speed that day. And then that'll also be kind of our lower body lift day. So we like to make that day a pretty intense day. That'll be match day -3. And then from there, the rest of the week is pretty light, kind of tapering back down towards the game. So -2, they'll do a lot of tactical stuff. There's kind of moments of intensity, kind of bigger, medium to like larger spaces, moments of intensity, but kind of like, okay, now let's walk back to where we started. Kind of giving them that physical recovery, but trying to keep the intensity fairly high. And then on match day -1, we play everyone's favorite game. It's called Over the River, Little Possession, kind of those sorts of things. End with a small-sided game, just kind of like something to make them feel good. They have fun about it, with it. And then we're back at another game day.
Great. And you mentioned that you'll do the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo. I know some clubs do like a submax test on that day as well. Or what other, I guess the first question is, what other monitoring methods do you utilize during the course of the week to assess kind of readiness to perform and train?
Yeah, so we'll do the yo-yos kind of like looking at heart rate. We'll also do a counter movement jump, typically on like the second day back in. So either -3 or -4, depending on travel, game schedule, everything like that. Looking at jump height on that, yes, but I think also RSI is a big one for us. You can manage your way to jump high, but do it kind of in a funky way. So kind of looking at RSI is another one that we've managed and looking at trends there is another one. We have daily wellness that we're looking at in terms of kind of readiness. I think a subjective, yes, it's subjective, but I think once again, coming back to that relationship piece, like a lot of players have had to fill out readiness questionnaires for their entire careers and have just found that no one looks at it. So we really make the effort to look at it every day and kind of like, once again, if you see something, going up to the player and having a conversation, they're like, oh, you are looking at it. And once again, it just kind of helps create that relationship and trust. And like, I can go to her if I feel like I need something different. So those are kind of the main ones that we do on a regular, like weekly basis. And then on a monthly basis, we'll do kind of our full strength testing battery where it's Nord board, seated knee extension, and then using the force frame for a couple of tests there as well, just to see, don't expect to gain a ton of strength throughout the season, but if we do see either any asymmetries that haven't been there in the past kind of pop up, potentially addressing those, and if we see anyone like really getting weaker throughout the year, once again, being able to kind of discuss those as a medical and performance staff and intervene if that's what we feel is necessary.
And so, how do you go about choosing which assessments or monitoring metrics you're going to be looking at over the course of the season? Obviously, we want to take into account the ask of the players and asking so many things of them. And then also, are we making sure that we're actually using that information, that it's helpful in our decision making? I remember, and this is still the case in the NWSL and women's leagues around the world, that unfortunately there is high staff turnover. Fortunately, there are new teams forming, expansion teams every year, new leagues forming, new investment being put into existing clubs, specifically in the performance and medical space. And so my first job in pro sport, again, like it was COVID year, whole new staff. And it was my first time working in pro sport. And it was kind of like, plan what you're going to do. And
Yeah.
so what advice would you give someone in that scenario of how to go about choosing which things you're going to track over the course of the season?
Yeah, I think like you can get information overload so easily, especially now with all of the bells and whistles and toys that there are out there. So I think we tried to limit it to, kind of like you said, to things that are not going to have a high burden on the athlete. So when we do our strength testing, it's all stuff that they typically have in their lift already. We'll just take one set. So if they're already doing Nordics, okay, go do one set on the Nord board. So we kind of get our monitoring that way. Okay, you're doing like a leg extension. One of your sets going to be a seated knee extension with a dynamo. You're doing Copenhagen's. All right, we'll do a groin squeeze on the force frame. Instead of that, where it's not another thing that they need to do, it's just kind of shifting things in a way that like, yes, they don't enjoy it, but we're not making them do kind of extra work. And then we picked those tests just because we get a hamstring, a quad, and groin. We also do a seated plantar flexion too, because we've actually seen a lot of lower leg injuries throughout the year, and I think that's one of like the sneaky ones that everyone talks, oh, quad, hamstring, all of those, but I think calf is a big one that kind of goes under the radar. So those are kind of why we picked those four strength tests. And then everything else is kind of part of training or the jumping they're going to do in their activation anyway. And we do that pre-training. So really try to limit it in terms of not asking them to do a ton more than they're already doing.
Yeah. And then same question for what metrics you look at and give higher value to when it comes to the GPS data.
Yeah, I think Once again, trying to simplify that as much as possible. I think for me, total distance is one that like you need to account for, but I'm more interested in kind of high speed running and sprinting. Like I can walk 5,000 meters and like it's not going to be the same as if I do 5,000 meters, but 1,000 of that is high speed running with 500 meters of sprinting. That's going to be a lot harder and more taxing on me physically and mentally than 5,000 meters of the total distance is important for kind of global load, but high speed running and sprinting are definitely more important for me, as well as number of accelerations and decelerations, because those are going to be pretty fatiguing as well. So those are kind of like I combine accels decels just for sake of making it easy to just see four metrics. So we'll look at total distance, high speed running, sprint distance, accels decels. Within parentheses, I look at percentage of max velocity, kind of like we talked about earlier with like the importance of hitting something high, like in the 90 plus percent during the week, just for hamstring health. So those are kind of the five main ones that I'll be looking at.
Okay, and so we discussed what the week looks like for the whole team. So now, how do you go in and take that weekly plan for the team and add some individual flair to it and account for what different individuals on the team are getting? Maybe looking at like their typical match output and adjusting for that. How much detail do you get into, or in depth do you get into for each individual's loading, both the on like with the GPS metrics and then also with the monitoring that you're doing in the gym?
Yeah, so I think for me, everything starts with the game. Like that is what that's the hardest day that you're going to have during the week. And that's basically indicative of what you need to do throughout the week to prepare you best for kind of that individual game. So we've got both players will be forwards, but one looks to play the ball into her feet versus one looks to play in behind. Like, yeah, their physical needs are going to be really different, even if they play the same position. So I like to start with their game data and then kind of work backwards from that. So kind of talked a little bit earlier about each player has like their own individual targets. They're all based off of kind of what they do in a game because that's how they play. Like, I'm not going to train differently like someone else just because we play the same position. So, kind of based off of that, yes, they'll each have targets for their each session throughout the week. So, if we're looking at, like we said, our -3 is our big high speed running and sprint distance day. Some players might need to do a little bit of extra running based off of that because some of our players just sprint a ton during games, and maybe the way that we train that day didn't get them to where they need to be for the day. So just kind of having those targets on kind of a daily and weekly basis. And then one of the like the interesting groups that needs to be individualized kind of more so than others is that low minute group just because they miss out on such a load during game day. So we're able to get a decent amount of high speed running after the game, but they really miss out on kind of like that overall volume and total distance, as well as like the change of direction, which is super important as well. So the change of direction we can make up kind of on our first day back in when starters aren't really doing as much. Um, but sometimes we'll have to make up some total distance on that side of things as well. So that can be additional top-up runs of just different amounts for each player throughout that session. Sometimes if we have 2 days off, we'll give players just a run to do kind of on their own whenever they choose to do, and that'll be different, have different intervals and or be different amount of time for the player just based off of what they need and what they've kind of had recently, just to make sure that they are ready to go if someone who has played a lot of minutes gets hurt and it's not a shock to their system and a huge spike in their load when they are called upon from a physical standpoint, but also like they can still perform and feel fit and feel good when they're on the field and not just feel like, oh, like I have to do more and I feel terrible now. So I think that's the biggest group that kind of needs individualization. Like higher minute players like get what they need from a load perspective on the weekend and feel pretty tired, but training's also catered to make sure that they get what they need throughout the week. Where that lower minute group is really the one that kind of typically falls short and really needs the most individualization as well.
Yeah, so I remember being again early in my career and thinking, okay, yes, like let's start with the match data. And then asking myself, okay, well, what do I do with that? So, what are the targets that you aim for each individual based on their match data? Is it, let's go with those four metrics that you track: total distance, high speed running, sprint, and XLs, D cells. Is it
Yep.
150%? Like, kind of what are your go to targets? Does that change at various points in the season? And why are those the targets? Like, how did you come to that decision?
Yeah, I think what the targets are is a great question. I think right now they are based off of research. Unfortunately, most of the research is based off of the men's game. So taking what research has, but also kind of using best practice, just what I've seen in the women's game and the teams that I've worked with. So I would say it's fairly close, kind of men and women, but I think there is a little bit of difference. So for total distance, I typically look to be around 130 to 150% of a game for like the week. For high speed running, anywhere from there's a wider range here. I like to be between 70 and 100. Research is like you can be 60 to 90. Some is like even lower than that, and that scares me a little bit. But I think sprint distance is another one that like I like to be closer to 90. The safe range is like 75 to 100 plus a little bit. I find that we don't typically have a problem getting our sprint distance targets just with the sprint exposures that we have. Usually gives us a nice little boost, plus playing 11v11 gets us there pretty nicely. Um, XLs, D cells is one that there's not a ton of research that I've found on. I've seen anywhere from 150 to 250% of what you do in a game, depending on kind of the band and threshold of like what the acceleration intensity is. So that's one that kind of I still play around with and don't put as much stock in as a target per se. But I think the other three, for sure, kind of 130, 150 for total distance, 70 to 90-ish, 100 for high speed running, and then I like to be around 90 for sprinting, but anywhere from kind of once again that 70 to 100 plus for sprint distance as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned the substitute group and how, like, that's one of the biggest challenges is getting them to meet those targets within a training week because they miss out on that big load of the game. So you mentioned doing some
Yeah.
top-up runs after the game. Of course, that's not always possible. There's players who don't travel. So what are some other of your
Yeah.
go-to strategies for doing that?
For players who don't travel, we'll typically have a session. Kind of if they don't travel, then they'll be here, and one of our performance coaches will run something with them on the field. We like to make it as kind of positionally relevant for them as possible. So I'll try to draw up something that works for them, where it's not just like dribbling around in a circle, like I don't know. But kind of make it as positionally relevant for them, trying to get like whatever 45 minutes, so at least a half of kind of a game load would be, so they don't miss out on that much. And then obviously if we're home, kind of the same thing would apply for players that don't dress. Kind of having that session in the morning. They'll also typically get a lift in, so a little bit of that stimulus as well to kind of just get a little bit more. And honestly, those players sometimes end up being physically in a better spot than players that do dress and don't end up playing because it's harder to get kind of that same load in a top-up run after a game, as you can when you can have a full session kind of on the field as you would with a non-dresser or someone who's not traveling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to go back again really quickly to the idea of using the match load as a target for players. Do you look mostly at their average match demands? Obviously, there's differences game to game depending on the context of the game.
Yep.
So how much are you looking at their average match demands versus something like a worst case scenario? Do you prep players for that worst case scenario? Is that something that is taken into account in your programming?
Yeah, I typically go closer to worst case scenario than average. I this year used kind of the average of their top three games. I think some players have like wild outliers for their max games, cause so I've used that in the past, but then it kind of gets thrown off where you have one game that's they just chased after someone for 90 minutes and sprinted everywhere. So I've done the average of their top three this past year to kind of use as a target, knowing that they're going to be somewhere within that range probably for like their target range. They might not be at the very top of their target range, but that's why it's a range. So if they don't kind of get there, but I think preparing them for that worst case scenario, because you do never know what's going to happen in a game. And I'd rather have them be over prepared than run the risk of under preparing them and then having something happen from because they were fatigued or not adequately prepared.
Yeah, and so then that kind of leads into yet another subgroup of players, which would be like injured and rehabbing players. So, how do you go about what's kind of your strategy for helping to plan and program their on field rehab? Is it something, again, every coach is different, where your coaching staff you're working with now are happy to have players in sessions in a modified way? Are you going to players and kind of planning that in advance, or are they just doing their own thing on the side? And then how do you go out planning what their weekly targets are?
I think the goal as quickly as possible is to kind of keep them on the team rhythm in terms of loading. So trying to keep the targets the same, but getting how we get there might be a little bit different. So if it's a big session for the teams, still trying to get as much as possible for them. So some of that might come with a ball and some of that might be straight line running. If they can't do stuff with a ball, it'll all be straight line running. And then kind of as they progress later on in their rehab, trying to do more and more of that with the ball. And then but yeah, trying to keep their loading on the same schedule as the team, just so that transition back into team activities or training is kind of as seamless as possible. And then integrating them, yes, as safely as possible with kind of the team. I've always had coaches that have been willing to have players be kind of in as much of sessions as possible, even if they can't be in the entire session, and just being able to work with those players and be like, hey, you're probably going to be in this drill and this drill, but then you'll need to step out and we'll probably need to finish with a little bit of running, and this is what the plan would be for that running. And just having those conversations. But like I said, I think the biggest thing is kind of getting them to do as much as possible, as safely as early as possible, and not having them deviate for that from that team schedule for too long. Just helps ease the transition back in and makes everyone kind of get back into full training as quickly and easily as possible.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the psychological aspect of it too, like keeping them on the team cadence, getting them involved as much as possible with the team, keeping them feeling like they're part of the team and not just off to the side in the gym doing these rehab sessions by themselves. It's already an isolating experience having an injury, and I think there's definitely something. And that's actually something I think that the women's game does better than the men's game, because I think it's far more common in the women's game for coaches to be okay with and accepting and wanting players who are injured to be incorporated into sessions in whatever way they can. I think it's more common on the men's side for coaches to say, like, I don't want them until they're 100%. So I think that's something that we actually get right on the
Yeah,
women's side.
for sure.
So, Gabby, I really appreciate you being on, but I can't let you go without asking you these two rapid fire questions that I ask every guest. So, the first one is kind of like a complete the sentence. So, the one thing that I wish everyone knew about sports science and women's soccer is.
Oh boy. I think we kind of touched on it. Like, so much of it is relationship based and not just kind of staring at a computer all day. Like, you're constantly interacting with players, with coaches, with medical staff, but the more you can kind of understand people as people and work with them in a way that helps them, like, ultimately, you just create better relationships and better trust and can have conversations and can kind of work with people in a better way. So, sports science is not just sitting at a computer all day staring at numbers and doing that. Like, there's so much of my job that's on the field having conversations. And I don't think I even realized that when I got into the field, how much of it really is relationship based still, no matter what.
Okay, and then the second one is my favorite thing about working in women's soccer is.
Just getting to be around the game every day. I think I grew up playing and like have been in jobs where I'm kind of in the gym more or doing other things, and I just miss being on the field and getting to talk about the game and be around it every day. We always have a game on somewhere, people are always talking about something, and I think it's fun to be around. It's fun to still get to kick a ball around every day. And I think like having played, it just gives me a different perspective that I can kind of relate to players on a different level a little bit. But I think just having the game still be such a big part of my life and get to go out to the field and do that every day, is something I definitely miss if I wasn't still kind of on the team side of things.
Yeah, that was definitely my favorite thing too. I think as people who have played this sport growing up and who love it and understand the sport, I remember there being times out on the training pitch, and this one year we had an insane roster. We had Eugenie Le Sommer, Sarah Bouadi, Jennifer Marajan, Megan Rapinoe, Jess Fishlock. Like it was just insanity. Alana Cook, like
It's just fun to watch.
yeah, there would be times that somebody would do something on the field and like the assistant coach and I would just look at each other and be like, "What? Like what? What did you see that?" It
Yeah.
was so fun. It
Yeah,
didn't feel like working.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's the
Well,
hour that you
Gabby,
just kind of like go to another place.
yeah, it's just like this can't be work. Like I'm literally watching some of the best players in the
Yeah.
world play a sport that I love. Like this is crazy. Gabby, where can people continue learning from you or follow your journey in the NWSL and beyond, and just stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn would probably be the best way. I believe it's Gabrielle Smith. And then, yeah, feel free to kind of reach out, message me, kind of do whatever you got to do, but that's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I love this kind of conversation because it gives real practical tidbits for people working in women's soccer when it comes, like, I think planning the week is one of the most fascinating, fun almost because it's kind of creative. You get to use creativity a
Yeah,
little bit, but also like deeply rooted in science. And it's just like such a fun part of the game, I think. So I hope people enjoy this as much as I clearly did.
definitely. Thanks for having me on.